pushing too hard on me.
Did you know that some of the most impressive, game-changing psychedelic albums never made it onto the charts? While bands like Pink Floyd and The Doors defined the genre for millions, an entire underground movement of psychedelic pioneers slipped through the cracks of mainstream history. Bands that were just as innovative, just as wild, but far less recognized. Join us in this video as we take a look at 10 psychedelic bands you must hear. Number 1. The 13th Floor Elevators. Before the Summer of Love, before Sgt. Pepper and Pink Floyd, before the world even had a word for it, there was the 13th Floor Elevators. This Texas band didn't just embrace psychedelia, they practically invented it. While other groups flirted with mind-expanding sounds, the Elevators lived and breathed it, channeling pure hallucinatory madness straight into their music. At the heart of the chaos was Rocky Erickson, a frontman with a voice that could shift from angelic to feral in an instant. And then there was the band's secret weapon, Tommy Hall, a self-styled psychedelic philosopher who didn't just play music, he had a mission. Hall's weapon of choice? An electric jug, filtered through reverb and delay, creating an eerie, bubbling undercurrent that made their songs sound like transmissions from another realm. Their debut album, The Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators, 1966, wasn't just a collection of trippy rock songs, it was a manifesto. The lead track, You're Gonna Miss Me, hits like a garage rock hurricane. Erickson's wailing vocals tearing through the mix while Hall's electric jug gurgles like some demented space instrument. But it's tracks like Roller Coaster and Reverberation, Doubt, that really showcase their brilliance. Songs that swirl with spiraling guitar lines, hypnotic rhythms, and an eerie sense of cosmic paranoia. But the Elevators didn't just play psychedelic music, they lived it. And in the 1960s, that had consequences. Rocky Erickson's increasing experimentation with LSD, combined with Texas law enforcement's brutal crackdown on counterculture, led to his tragic institutionalization. By the end of the decade, the band had imploded, leaving behind a legacy that would only be fully appreciated decades later. Every psychedelic band that came after, the Flaming Lips, Spacemen 3, Tame Impala, owes something to the wild, untamed vision of the 13th Floor Elevators. They were the first to truly see the other side, and their music remains as groundbreaking as ever. Number 2. Spirit. If the 13th Floor Elevators were pure unfiltered chaos, Spirit was something else entirely. They weren't just about trippy soundscapes and far-out lyrics. They fused jazz, classical, and rock into something both sophisticated and surreal. Formed in Los Angeles in the late 1960s, Spirit was helmed by Randy California, a teenage guitar prodigy who, at just 15 years old, played in a band with Jimi Hendrix. But what set Spirit apart wasn't just California's Hendrix-level chops. It was the presence of Ed Cassidy, their drummer, and also Randy's stepfather. Cassidy, a seasoned jazz musician nearly 30 years older than his bandmates, brought a level of rhythmic complexity that made Spirit stand out in a sea of acid rock imitators. Their 1970 album 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus is an absolute masterpiece, one of the most forward-thinking psychedelic albums ever made. Take Nature's Way, a haunting eco-conscious ballad with airy harmonies and acoustic guitars that float like mist, or Animal Zoo, which blends playful lyrics with a jazz-funk groove that could have come from a Steely Dan record. And then there's Mechanical World, from their Spirit album, a slow-burning piece drenched in eerie organ tones and ghostly guitar leads. But despite their brilliance, Spirit always seemed one step away from mainstream success. While their contemporaries The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, were playing Woodstock and filling stadiums, Spirit remained an underground favorite, revered by musicians but largely ignored by the masses. That didn't stop them from leaving their mark. Ever heard Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven? Many believe its opening chord progression was inspired, some say copied, from Spirit's instrumental Taurus. A lawsuit followed, but regardless of legal outcomes, it's clear that Spirit's influence ran deep. Even today, their music feels ahead of its time. Psychedelia with brains, heart, and restless experimental spirit. If you love the genre and haven't heard 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus, you're missing out on one of the greatest hidden treasures. Next up, we're focusing on a band that used primitive electronics to warp reality itself. A group so ahead of its time that modern trip-hop artists still cite them as an influence. Number 3. Silver Apples. Psychedelic music isn't just about fuzz guitars and swirling acid trip visuals. Sometimes it's about rewiring your brain with sound itself, and no band did that quite like Silver Apples. Formed in New York in 1967, Silver Apples weren't your typical psych rock outfit. In fact, they barely even used guitars. Instead, they built their sound around a homemade synthesizer rig, a Frankenstein's monster of oscillators, wires, and knobs that looked like it had been ripped straight out of a science lab. The mastermind behind this bizarre setup? Simeon Cox, the band's singer and sonic architect, who simply called his creation the Simeon. From the moment you drop the needle on their 1968 self-titled debut, you know you're in for something entirely different. The opening track, Oscillations, doesn't just play with melody, it warps it, stretching and twisting electronic pulses into hypnotic rhythms. It's as if the song breathes, shifting and pulsing, like some alien intelligence trying to communicate. And beneath it all, drummer Danny Taylor holds everything together with tight, relentless beats, making Silver Apples feel strangely danceable, despite their otherworldly sounds. And it gets shocking when you find out the music wasn't made with the help of fancy studio equipment. Silver Apples were DIY electronic pioneers, building their sounds from scratch at a time when the idea of electronic music was still light years away from mainstream rock. Their second album, Contact, 1969, took things even further, blending eerie dystopian lyrics with even more electronic experimentation. But just as they were gaining momentum, disaster struck. Legal trouble with Pan Am Airlines over their album cover, which featured a crashed airplane, effectively killed their career. For decades, Silver Apples remained an obscure piece in psychedelic history, until the 90s, when artists like Portishead, Beck and Broadcast rediscovered them. Suddenly their influence was everywhere, and a new generation of experimental musicians hailed them as visionaries, who had seen the future decades before anyone else. If you're looking for psychedelic music that doesn't just alter your perception, but completely reshapes the sonic landscape, Silver Apples are the perfect band for you. Number 4. The Seeds.
Pushing too hard on me.
The Seeds were about raw, unfiltered energy. The kind that made you want to stomp, shout, and break through every barrier in your way. Emerging from Los Angeles in the mid-60s, the Seeds were garage psych at its most primal. While some bands were experimenting with orchestration and studio, the Seeds kept things dirty, loud, and ferociously simple. Front and center was Sky Saxon, a singer whose manic, howling delivery made every song sound like it was teetering on the edge of insanity. His voice wasn't traditionally good, but it didn't need to be. He wasn't just singing, he was channeling something animalistic. Their most famous track, Pushing Too Hard, is a perfect example. The relentless two-chord riff hammers away like a jackhammer, while Saxon sneers and wails about some unforeseen force trying to hold him back. It's punk before punk, psychedelia before it had a name, a song that feels like rebellion in sonic form. And then there's Can't Seem to Make You Mine, a slow-burning hypnotic plea that drips with desperation. The keyboards swirl, the guitar lines snake in and out, and Saxon sounds like a man possessed. It's a song that the Ramones, the Cramps, and even Iggy Pop later cited as a massive influence, because even though the Seeds never hit it big, their raw energy left a deep mark on rock history. While the Seeds had all the ingredients of a legendary band, they never quite broke through. By the late 60s, psychedelia was evolving, moving toward the polished, ambitious sound of Pink Floyd and the Beatles. The Seeds, with their wild-eyed simplicity, started to feel out of step. Saxon tried to push the band in more experimental directions, but it never fully worked. By the early 70s, the Seeds had faded, leaving behind a few underground classics that punk, garage, and psych bands would later dig up and worship. Today, the Seeds stand as a raw, unfiltered snapshot of what psychedelia could be. Not soft, dreamy, or ethereal, but wild, untamed, and defiantly loud. If you love garage rock and want to hear where bands like the Stooges, the White Stripes, and the Black Keys got their fire, start here. Number 5. Country Joe and the Fish.
What are we fighting for? Don't ask young, don't give them.
San Francisco in the 1960s was the center of psychedelic rock. But while many bands were content to float through dreamlike soundscapes, Country Joe and the Fish had something sharper in mind. They weren't just about expanding minds. They were about blowing them wide open with biting political satire, free-form acid jams, and a sense of radical urgency that set them apart. Formed in Berkeley in 1965, the band was led by Country Joe McDonald, a fiercely intelligent songwriter who blended folk, rock, and psychedelia into something both groovy and deeply subversive. Their debut album, Electric Music for the Mind and Body, 1967, is a psychedelic masterwork, a record that perfectly captures the swirling, unpredictable energy of the era. The album's opener, Flying High, lures you in with its trippy organ swells and free-flowing structure, but it's bass strings in section 43 that truly transport you. These songs don't just sound psychedelic, they feel like an LSD trip unfolding in real time, a mix of fluid, melodies, and unpredictable shifts in tone and texture. But it wasn't all blissed out jams. Country Joe and the Fish had teeth. Their most infamous moment came at Woodstock in 1969, when McDonald took the stage alone and led the crowd in a profanity-laced anti-war chant, before launching into I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die rag, a scathing indictment of the Vietnam War disguised as a gleeful sing-along. While its ragtime-inspired melody and darkly sarcastic lyrics, be the first one on your block to have your boy come home in a box, the song cut through the peace and love haze of the festival and delivered something raw, angry, and impossible to ignore. It cemented Country Joe and the Fish as the political conscience of the psychedelic movement, a band that didn't just embrace the counterculture, but challenged it to do something more than just drop acid and drift away. Their sound, their message, and their fearlessness made them an essential piece of psychedelic history. If you're looking for music that sounds like the 60s but also challenges you to think, start with Electric Music for the Mind and Body. It's as impressive now as it was back then. Number 6. The Zombies.
It's the time of the season.
Unlike most of the bands in this video, the Zombies weren't underrated by design. They were a band that had all the talent in the world but somehow never quite got their moment in the spotlight. Hailing from St. Albans, England, the Zombies had a sound that set them apart from their British invasion peers. While bands like the Rolling Stones and the Kinks were leaning into raw, bluesy rock, the Zombies took a different route, one that was sophisticated, jazzy, and drenched in Baroque psychedelia. Their early hits like She's Not There and Tell Her No showcased their skills in haunting melodies, jazzy chord changes, and Colin Blunstone's ethereal vocals. But while these singles saw some success, the Zombies struggled to break through in a scene dominated by more aggressive, blues-heavy acts. In 1968, they were on the verge of breaking up, but not before recording one last album, an album that would eventually become one of the greatest psychedelic masterpieces of all time, Odyssey and Oracle. Yeah, that's Odyssey with an accidental misspelling, a mistake made by their album designer that somehow stuck. But nothing else about this record feels like an accident. From the rich, melancholic beauty of A Rose for Emily to the dreamlike harmonies of Hung Up on a Dream, the album is psychedelic pop at its most refined and elegant. And then there's Time of the Season, a song that would eventually become the Zombies' biggest hit, but only years after the band had already split up. With its whispered vocals, hypnotic bassline, and seductive groove, it remains one of the most instantly recognizable songs from the era, a track that sounds eternally fresh and mysterious. The tragic part is that by the time Odyssey and Oracle started gaining recognition, the Zombies were already gone. They had disbanded before they could see their masterpiece get the love it deserved. For decades, the album was an underground classic, a favorite that slowly but surely gained the legendary status it holds today. And when the Zombies finally reunited in the 2000s to perform the album in full, they were met with the kind of rapturous reception that had eluded them in their prime. If the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was psychedelia's bold experimental statement, then Odyssey and Oracle was its introspective, melancholic counterpart. A record that doesn't just send you to another world, but lingers in your soul long after it's over. So we've seen some protest music that shook the establishment, and a band that created a timeless masterpiece in total obscurity. But up next, we're going into the kind of music that sounds like it was recorded in a haunted basement and meant to be played at full volume. Number 7, the Sonics. Before punk, before heavy metal, before most rock bands even thought about getting truly dangerous, there were the Sonics, emerging from Tacoma, Washington, in the early 60s. The Sonics played like they had nothing to lose, louder, nastier, and more aggressive than just about anything else at the time. While other garage bands were experimenting with chords and psychedelic textures, the Sonics cranked everything past the breaking point. Their guitars were distorted and blown out, their drums sounded like thunder in a cave, and Jerry Rosley's vocals, he didn't just sing, he shrieked, howled, and screamed like a man possessed. Their 1965 debut, Here Are the Sonics, is proto-punk before the term even existed. Tracks like Psycho and Strict 9 weren't just wild, they were downright dangerous. The latter, a song about drinking poison, just for the thrill of it, remains one of the most menacing garage rock anthems ever recorded. The Sonics weren't making music for flower children to drift away to. They were making something feral and completely unhinged. And yet, despite their legendary status among punk and garage bands, they never achieved mainstream success. Why? Because they were simply too much too soon. While contemporaries like the Kinks and the Rolling Stones played with distortion, the Sonics set their amplifiers on fire, while other bands cleaned up their sound for radio. The Sonics refused to compromise, and for that, they remained a cult phenomenon rather than chart-topping stars. But here's the thing, their influence never faded. Everyone from Nirvana to the White Stripes to the Hives owes something to the Sonics. Even now, their music sounds raw and untamed, a blast of pure adrenaline that still rips through speakers like a wildfire. If you want to hear the darker, wilder side of 60s psychedelia, the kind that wasn't about expanding your consciousness, but about blowing your mind apart, start with Here Are the Sonics. Just be warned, it still hits like a punch to the gut. Number 8. The Electric Prunes.
I had too much to drink last night.
Few bands embody psychedelic unpredictability quite like the Electric Prunes. Their name alone suggests something strange and surreal, and their music, it was exactly that. Trippy, mysterious, and always a little unsettling. Hailing from Los Angeles, the Electric Prunes are best known for their 1966 cult hit, I Had Too Much to Dream Last Night. With its eerie, reverb-drenched guitar intro and ghostly vocals, it feels like a lucid dream gone wrong. Exactly the kind of thing that made psychedelia so fascinating. The Electric Prunes weren't just about creating trippy singles. They were one of the first psych bands to fully embrace experimental production, pushing studio effects and sound manipulation to their absolute limits. Their 1968 album, Mass in F minor, took this to a completely new level. An entire psychedelic rock mass, sung in Latin. It was so complex and ambitious that the band couldn't even play most of it live. This kind of wild experimental spirit was both their greatest strength and their downfall. They were a band that never settled into a single identity, constantly shifting between garage rock, orchestral psych, and completely new soundscapes. And while that made for some incredible, mind-expanding music, it also meant they were never able to fully break through. By the end of the 60s, the Electric Prunes had all but vanished, their name taken over by different musicians, as the original lineup faded away. But their music never disappeared. In the decades that followed, their influence spread through film soundtracks, underground psych scenes, and experimental rock circles. Their sound is pure, unfiltered psychedelia. Not the clean, polished variety, but the kind that feels like an out-of-body experience, strange and a little unsettling. If you want to hear a band that pushed psychedelic rock to its absolute weirdest, start with I Had Too Much to Dream Last Night, and let yourself get lost in the trance. Number 9, the Dukes of Stratosphere. In the mid-1980s, an album was released that felt like a direct transmission from 1967, layered with guitars, swirling mellotron, and surreal lyrics about time travel, aliens, and magic lanterns. The band behind it? A mysterious group called the Dukes of Stratosphere. Except, they didn't exist. The Dukes were actually XTC in disguise, one of the most inventive new wave bands of their era. But instead of making another record under their own name, they decided to create a full-blown 1960s psychedelic alter ego, complete with fake backstories, outrageous costumes, and music that was so authentic, it fooled even hardcore psych fans. Their 1985 EP, 25 O'Clock, wasn't just a tribute, it was a masterpiece of musical time travel, capturing the sound, feel, and weirdness of classic psych rock better than most actual 60s bands. Tracks like Bike Ride to the Moon and The Mole from The Ministry sound like Lost Beatles and Pink Floyd outtakes, full of tape effects, backwards guitars, and mind-bending harmonies. What made it even wilder? XTC pulled it off too well. Fans loved 25 O'Clock so much that some preferred it over their main discography. The experiment was such a success that the Dukes came back for a full-length album, Sonic Sunspot in 1987, another flawless piece. But despite the fact that the band had been created as a joke, there was no denying that the Dukes of Stratosphere were becoming fan favorites. Their sound that was once a playful pastiche became an inspiration for future generations of neo-psych artists. They may have started as a hoax, but in the end, the Dukes left a very real mark on the psychedelic music world. So if you're looking for psychedelia at its most colorful, playful, and wonderfully absurd, start with 25 O'Clock. Just don't be surprised if you start wondering whether time itself is bending around you. Number 10. Rain Parade. By the early 1980s, psychedelia was supposed to be dead. The 60s had long passed. Punk had burned everything down, and new wave was taking over the airwaves. But in Los Angeles, something strange was happening. A new generation of musicians was rediscovering the hazy beauty of 60s psych, giving it a slightly modern twist. This movement became known as the Paisley Underground. At the heart of it was Rain Parade. Founded by David Roback and Matt Pucci, Rain Parade took the ethereal melodies of the Byrds and the trippy textures of Pink Floyd, then drenched them in a moody, dreamlike atmosphere that felt completely fresh. Their 1983 debut Emergency Third Rail Power Trip is a lost classic, full of stringing guitars, hypnotic rhythms, and vocals that drift through the mix like smoke. Tracks like Kaleidoscope and What She's Done to Your Mind feel like acid flashbacks wrapped in sadness. Unlike the free-spirited psychedelia of the 60s, Rain Parade's music felt more introspective, more cinematic, like a long-lost memory slowly surfacing from the depths of your mind. But just as they were on the verge of breaking through, the band splintered. David Roback left to explore new sounds, eventually forming the dream pop legends Mazzy Star. Rain Parade continued. Their influence was already cemented. They had helped revive psychedelia for a new generation, paving the way for bands like the Flaming Lips, Tame Impala, and even shoegaze legends like My Bloody Valentine. Today, Rain Parade remains one of the most underrated yet deeply influential psych bands of the 80s, proving that psychedelia wasn't just a phase. It was a feeling, a sound, a vision that could evolve and adapt across decades. Which of these underground psychedelic bands blew your mind the most? Or did we miss a hidden gem you swear by? Let us know in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed this video and love discovering overlooked music, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We've got plenty more videos into the weird, wild, and wonderful coming your way.